does all
Okay.
kinds of other things, because I did it wrong for about a week.
Thank you all for coming, and you're on time.
So-
That's
I kept trying to push.
we might have to wait just a little bit. I want to start the meeting and get going. We'll call the order or the roll call whenever they stop talking over there, and we get the rest of the counselors in here. So we've already started. So, and they should be in shortly. I had, there's 100 pages here, and I don't do this for a living. I would like to have us consider breaking it up into a couple parts. And I think in respect to what you all have done, it's a lot of work, it looks like. And for us that don't live this day in and day out, if the council, I would like to suggest to council that we do eat it off a few bites at a time. And again, part of me is because I didn't have a whole hours to read through this, but I do want to respect because I know you've done a lot of hard work on it. Maybe you'd like to suggest, if you want to, how we would do it, unless you feel there's a huge rush to get this done, that we could bite it off in 2 or 3 sections. I think, seriously, I think what will happen is we're going to go through it and miss something, or maybe not pay the right respect to what you've all done.
So
Dina?
do we need to start with roll call?
Yes, we
And-
do, but I was going to wait till they get in here.
Yep, and so we'll get into that, Mayor.
Okay.
We'll address that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, as long as we'll clear the warrants on the rest of the counselors and uncuff them and get them in here. Who's missing?
Jim and Jim. And Jim. Mr. Mayor, I'd just like to say for the record, I'm much more interested in mercy than justice.
I am unaware of either of those two people, so. The point is that we have staff here waiting, and I think we should, if they're here, you're here. Mr. Lancaster, how much is a water tap? Oh. Oh, residential? Okay, I just want to know. Spoken like a true engineer. How big, how high, how thick, or something. Okay, since we're all here, appreciate for all you being on time. Would you please call the roll, please?
Councilmember Cochran.
Here.
Councilmember Gonzalez.
Here.
I can speak, excuse me. Councilmember Hemrick.
Here.
Councilmember Jaquez.
Here.
Councilmember Meisner.
Here.
Councilmember Turner.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Smith.
Here.
Mayor Troutman.
Here.
All present.
Okay, thank you all for coming. As we had talked to Ms. Svetlik, Dina, that this is a lot to go through. I would like to chat with you about the possibilities of what your thoughts would be if we can, unless you see an extreme emergency for doing it quickly, maybe we could plod through it in 2 or 3 sections. What's your thinking on that?
Yeah, I think if we go through our presentation that we've prepared, you'll have a much better understanding
Okay.
of the 90+ some pages.
Okay.
So the intent today for this work session is to provide an overview of what we're trying to accomplish with this reorganization. We don't think we're necessarily going to have all of the answers today, but let's start by going through it and helping, hopefully help you understand what we're trying to do with this reorganization that involves several titles within the municipal code.
Okay, good. All right. So would you like, any questions from the council? Would you mind starting off then, or one of you?
Sure. Okay. So there's really 4 components that we want to walk through today to try to have you understand the 90+ some pages that were in the packet, which I'm sure seem to be a bit overwhelming. So what does that really involve? So there's 4 components to walk through today to help you understand that. The first is when did this all start? Why are we proposing to do this? Who is all involved in the different components? And what really are the guts of the modifications that we're proposing. So this really started in the first quarter of 2017, and this was started on between staff and the city attorney. They started working on this at that time. The impetus really was to remove duplicative components in multiple places within the municipal code. So not just within Title VIII necessarily, but within the entirety of different components of the municipal code. And so that work really started in first quarter of 2017. So I know a few of you were here, and you may or may not remember that we initially introduced this to council at a general government meeting on September 6th of 2017. And at that time, to introduce the issue, the packet was extremely brief. It was basically 3 pages. It was a cover memo, and then we had literally inserted a sheet of the existing Title VIII and did a brief markup of what we were considering at that time in terms of some of the reorganization. And we'll get into that a little bit further. But I just wanted to remind folks that this is really the second time that council has seen this as a body in one of your work sessions. So there's really 3 primary reasons that staff has been looking at this for about a year and a half now. Number 1 is focusing on Title VIII, which is the nuisance section. Title VIII is typically enforced by code enforcement, and so we really want to try to keep only nuisance-related items in Title VIII. And really what we found is over time, Title VIII has become a bit of a catch-all, and included other components that are really enforced by other departments within the city. So the first component is really trying to clean up Title VIII and have it primarily focus on the nuisance work that Code Enforcement Division does within the city. The second component of that is relocating other components to their respective titles. So again, those, and we'll get into that a little bit more. And the third thing is updating and clarifying language within all of the respective components. You know, it's interesting when we were going back and looking at this that we found that I think we've had discussions with other titles, say the Title 17, the zoning, where the last major overhaul of that dates to about 1991. And really the last major overhaul of Title VIII, some of the earliest references that I could find go back to at least 1974. So there really hasn't been a comprehensive overhaul of Title VIII. It's just been sort of the catch-all for numerous decades at this point, and so we'd really like to clean it up. And I think Patrick has a great analogy in terms of what we're trying to accomplish.
In terms of explaining what it is we're intending to do, everyone has one of those utility drawers in their homes where all sorts of miscellaneous stuff gets stuck. Old flashlights, batteries, tape measures, old warranty cards for things you no longer even own. They all just get stuck in this drawer, and over time it just accumulates stuff. And every now and then you've got to go in and pull stuff out of that drawer and find out what you've actually got and what you want to do with it. Title VIII, for good or ill, has become sort of the utility drawer for our municipal code. And what we're attempting to do with this is take what's in there out, move some of it to more appropriate places where those items probably better belong, and then with what's going to remain, organize it in such a way where things are a little easier to find in the future. So that's essentially an overview of what we're attempting to do with this.
Thank you, Patrick. So what are those respective components? What are the pieces we're trying to clean up and get back where they belong, whether it's in the toolbox or the utility room or the laundry room, so to speak? So this is an overview of those components that we're really cleaning up and moving. So the first component is, as we've mentioned, is Title VIII, is currently called Health and Safety. And again, the whole gist of this is to really focus that specifically on nuisances. And so the proposal is to change that title to nuisances and have it focus on nuisances. The other component that is affected by this is moving some components that are currently in Title VIII to Title IX, which is really enforced by the police department. The next component is really clarifying some language that's currently both within Title VIII and Title XII in terms of enforcement of different aspects of the public right-of-way, and we're trying to make it more clear in terms of what is under code enforcement's purview and what is under city engineer's purview. And then the fourth item in terms of the cleanup is actually moving a component to Title 15, and we'll walk through that a little bit more. And then really this is introducing and creating a new Title 14 specifically to discuss pretty much the existing stormwater and floodplain regulations, and Adam will talk through that a little bit later. So those are really the gist of the overview of what we're trying to accomplish here with this cleanup of the junk drawer. So the other thing I think that it's important to keep in mind is within those 90-plus pages that were in your packet, this is really how that's split out in terms of the content. So in terms of your packets, really pages 1 through 32 are Title VIII. Pages 32 through 38 are Title IX components and changes. Title 12 are page, I don't know if that's a typo. Well, actually, it's a very brief change, so it's just that one page. So page 32 in your packet addresses the changes within Title 12. And then pages 38 through 45 of your packet deal with the modifications affecting Title 15. And then the creation of a new Title 14 is really pages 45 through 94, or the bulk of your packet that you have. So hopefully that helps you break it down a little bit more, and this might become sort of an outline for future discussions if we break this up and have future discussions and further meetings. So, and I know most of council knows this, I added this in primarily for trying to educate, again, members of the public as we continue these efforts in terms of what's the difference between our municipal code and what exactly is an ordinance. And as we know, that the ordinance is really just the legal venue for that reorganization or updating any language within our municipal code. So the draft ordinance in this case is very long because we're addressing 5 different titles of our municipal code. And that's why the ordinance seems like a really big ordinance. As those changes then get adopted, those actually become part of our municipal code book that's sitting in front of Josh. So let's walk through each title, title by title. So in terms of Title VIII itself, what are we really focusing on? We're really focusing on cleaning up the definitions. Again, right now in Title VIII, because so many different components have been adopted over the years and added in over the years, each chapter within Title VIII has definitions at the beginning of each chapter. The idea here is we're pulling out all of those definitions and having them at the very beginning of Title VIII, so they're all in one place. And hopefully we don't have any duplicates of definitions that might be conflicting with each other in different sections or different titles within Title VIII. So the first piece of this is pulling out all of the definitions and having them up front at the very beginning of Title VIII. Then we have a couple of things that we're trying to clarify in terms of definitions, and one example of that is property. Right now in our municipal code, the current definition of property basically includes everything. It's one definition, and it basically says property is public and private property. Well, that's great, but there's a lot of times where we're trying to specifically define the difference between public property and private property. So that's one example where we're clarifying that by splitting it out and having a specific definition for public property and a specific definition for private property. And then we've also added, I think we decided that trailer was really the only brand new definition that we're proposing to add to Title VIII. And the reason for that is because there's been some confusion and it's really not clear in the current code when code enforcement is out doing their job and trying to notify properties for nuisances. it's not really clear the difference between, say, a motorized vehicle and a trailer and how those regulations apply to a trailer versus, say, a more traditional motorized vehicle like a car or an RV or a motorcycle, for instance. So we've added a definition of trailer. Some of the updates and clarifications to Title VIII also include eliminating multiple references to a nuisance. So again, the idea is to make it more clear for the public and more clear for staff that are trying to do their job. And right now, littering, for example, is identified in 3 different locations within Title VIII. And again, I think this is, just because the fact that there's been so many updates that have occurred over multiple decades, we ended up with 3 different references to littering within the code. We're trying to have it in one place instead of 3. And then, again, as has been mentioned previously, we're just simply trying to reorganize the chapters within Title VIII to have a more logical flow. So 95% of what's in the packet just for the Title VIII component is the exact same content that is currently within Title VIII. It's just reorganized in terms of the numbering system and logical flow of information. It's only about 5% of it that's actually new or different content that we're proposing, such as adding a definition or clarifying a definition that we've talked about before. And then I mentioned the numbering system, and then the other thing that we're doing is we're also just trying to remove just obsolete language that just doesn't apply anymore in codes. And one of the examples of that is we have a specific chapter dealing with abandoned ice boxes. And that was a big deal maybe 40, 50 years ago, right, where we know that children and people were getting caught in old refrigerators that were being left out on the curb, and so there was a specific chapter presumably adopted at that time to deal with that specifically. So we've cleaned that up, and we still are addressing that, but just within sort of modern language and a current logical place for that to exist within the code. And so then, so that's really the summary in terms of Title VIII. Again, it's really about reorganization. 95% of the content is not changing at all. It's just moving to a different location or getting a new number or a new name in some instances. And only about 5% of the content is really being proposed to be updated or changed or added for Title VIII. And so with that, I'll turn it over to our city attorney to talk about Title IX.
Sure. So besides moving fireworks and open fires and open burning to Title IX, I believe over the summer conversations started with staff and Tony and the chief of police and our office regarding kind of revising some of the language regarding fire bans. And so that language has been added in there, that the city administrator has authorization to institute a ban upon consultation with the fire district. In addition to that change, we also added language about the duration of that ban, and so it allows him to extend it if necessary. And then we also added a penalty provision, which didn't exist in that. And lastly, we clarified the definition. Open fires and open burning is actually one term in the ordinance you have in front of you. We added that fireworks, which are typically permissible, are now included in that definition. So if a ban were to go into place, those fireworks would be impermissible. So they would change. And it also allows some exclusions of what is not open burning and open fires. So those were the changes that were made when it was moved.
Okay, so then in Title 12, again, here we are simply trying to clarify language. So really we're actually pulling a little bit of information or language out of Title 12 that also exists in Title 8, and we're simply trying to clarify some of the enforcement role that code enforcement plays in terms of some of the public realm versus what city engineering typically has purview over. And that's really that code enforcement often focuses on basically the curb or edge of pavement back, towards a private property, and that's really what they focus on in their day-to-day work, versus city engineering and the staff group there really focuses on the curb or the edge of pavement into the roadway. And so we're just trying to clarify that language and basically get it in one place in terms of what code enforcement does. And for Title 15, I'll turn it back to the city attorney.
So this one's pretty easy. This was just moved. No changes were made to this section other than numbering and cross-referencing to other sections. So we didn't change any language.
And now Adam.
Yeah, so what we're talking about, the new Title 14 is, stormwater didn't belong in the junk drawer. It should have had its own chapter from the beginning. So we're going to make its own drawer. Essentially, there's 3 sections to stormwater. The biggest part of this is what Dina just alluded to on Title 12. We created a section called, it's going to be 1410, and it's titled Drainage. And so it takes that piece of the right-of-way that deals with drainage, and it puts it under the stormwater engineering umbrella rather than code enforcement. And so we've added definitions. In Title 12, the section that's being deleted, it's a very vague, I think it's 1 or 2 sentences about the property owner's responsibilities to keep ditches and curbs free-flowing and that sort of stuff. There's no definitions or anything else that are tied to that. So we're creating this subsection that has definitions of what a ditch is and who the owner is, the occupant, and all that sort of stuff, and whose responsibilities those are. So that's what we're doing there with 1410. Then 20 has to do with illicit discharges and permitting for stormwater. That's all the same, except for we have just been issued a new state permit by the state of Colorado, by Department of Health. And with that new permit, we had to clean up some of our language. So we were planning, before this effort was kind of spearheaded, we were planning on having to come to you anyway to make those tweaks. It makes sense to do that now. We have to do those by, I think it's July 1st of next year. Those changes have to be complete. Essentially, those have to do with, we had to update and expand some definitions to match the state language. We added some illicit discharges that are permitted now by the state. They weren't before. We had to change our notifications when there's a spill and how the Department of Health is notified. So we had to add some language for that. We eliminated a requirement for people to be certified and trained in erosion and sediment control. That was something that we had copied when we initially created our language from a different municipality. We don't enforce it. We don't see any value in that. So it's one of those things that we needed to clean up. And then finally, we had to tweak our enforcement and penalties section so that it starts on the day of the violation until the cleanup is done on a spill or illicit discharge. And again, that's all to connect with the new state language that's in our new state permit. And then finally, the floodplain regulations will have to move over into this chapter, but there's no change whatsoever there. So there's 33 pages of these 94 that there's no change except for it has a new number in front of it. That's it for drainage and stormwater.
Mr. Meisner?
It's maybe a question for both you and Dina.
Mm-hmm.
I understood that Title 8 would have one section for definitions. That would cover that entire title?
For Title 8, correct.
Yeah.
But I see in 14 we have 2 sections at least that have definitions.
Right. Actually, there's all 3 sections have definitions in stormwater because they are defined differently based on what the purpose of that section is. So illicit discharges, for example, has to follow the definitions that are within the state stormwater discharge permit. And then the definitions for floodplain have to follow the federal guidelines for FEMA and floodplain mapping and those sorts of things. So,
But why can't we have just one section for all the definitions relative to Title 14?
we could, I would have to check to make sure we don't have any conflicts there. But we could, unless, you see any issue with that, Catherine?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I think if there's any conflicts or issues like that, I guess, and I totally understand where you're coming from and your confusion. So,
I'm not confused, but
well, your question, how about that?
okay.
The reason why the definitions are all in one section for the entire chapter, or the entire Title 8, is because those definitions apply to that entire title. In Title 14, those are distinct regulations in each chapter with their own definitions. That's not the case necessarily in Title 8. So we can do what you're asking, but we need to be careful that we don't have a similar term used in two different regulations that might have a slightly different definition.
Right, so what it would mean, so from time to time, the state and feds change their regulations. And what it would mean, typically what they send us is a model regulation that we just cut and paste. And what that would mean in the future, we'd have to be careful about that. Again, that we're covering that in every section that might be referred to, and we're trying to avoid that. We're trying to say, okay, when floodplain regulations are updated, we just pull out 1430, throw it away, and put the new 1430 in there. Otherwise, you're going back through the code again to try to find every place it's referred to change it.
But I understood part of the reasoning, which I agree, for the combining of all the definitions was to eliminate any duplication or conflict. But I'm interpreting from your statement that XYZ term could have two different definitions in Title 14.
It could, because you're comparing apples to oranges. Title 8 is one regulation in and of itself. It's nuisances. So those definitions apply to that entire title. In Title 14, you have 3 separate distinct regulations that could possibly use similar terminology with different meanings. They are regulated by different state agencies, and so they are distinct regulations. That's different than Title 8, which is just one regulation administered by the city and nobody else.
So should we not just have one Title 14 that combines those 3 and not have 3 separate titles so that there is not that confusion?
Well, you have 3 separate chapters within one title.
If anything, you'd be better off with separate chapters for each rather
Right.
than trying to combine them.
Right.
But they all got stuck in the same chapter because they're all administered by the same group, and they all have to do with water running downhill. So that's why we grouped them that way. But it would be, rather than mash them, it'd be better having a 14, 15, 16 or something like that. But I don't.
That's my point.
And we haven't.
And we can certainly
Your
put
question's a good one. We can look at. We did not analyze it from that point of view. So, I mean, we could take a look at combining the definitions. If it's not a big deal, it's not a big deal. If it is, then we could talk about splitting the chapters again.
I mean, that's my preference. I mean, I prefer to see definitions at the front of a section chapter that applies to that whole. So you're not, like you say, you're not going through there to try to find a definition. You know exactly where it's going to be. It seems to be defeating in 14.
And if I understand you correctly, then if one of the solutions to this problem, we call this a problem, is separate chapters for each regulation,
Absolutely.
you know, that may be.
We can put them in separate titles.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not an issue.
And that way, you know, actually, that way it becomes more clear that they're separate subjects, and there may be different enforcement mechanisms that apply.
Sure. So let us analyze which would be the best of those
Okay.
two options. And
Yeah, I mean, that's, yeah.
Anyone else?
I have other questions, but let them go.
Okay.
Can I just mention, sorry, one thing we kind of skipped over? It was the smoking in public places. I just wanted to note that that also contained no changes. It was only just moved, and so just the numbering was changed. I know that was a controversial subject at the time, so I wanted to ensure that there weren't any changes to it.
And where was it moved from and to?
It was in 8. It was at the beginning of Title 8, and it was moved to 9, because it's really a police
Okay.
regulation.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's it.
Again, I would prefer it be in pieces. There's so much we wants to say, and you know it. You're schooled in this. You work this. I don't. None of these people do. And the public has to read this and possibly have to be looked at for a code enforcement officer. And I would like to take just 8 by itself, exactly the way you want it, the way it's going to be done, that we're going to approve it. And let's have a session just on that. And Dina, honestly, I appreciate that. I would have liked to have that in my packet. I understand it better now that you've done it that way. But again, I think you have to understand, and you do understand, and the public has to understand. I don't do this for a living. And so I'm confronted with 100 pages that is a crazy quilt of numbers and all kinds of definitions that I never saw before. I would like to have the opportunity to see, let's see 8 all by itself, the way it's actually going to be approved. What you've given us is this, and you want us to approve the whole thing. I got no debate about that, but I didn't have time to go through it either.
One thing that we
So-
talked about, sorry, Dina, was giving you a red line type or synopsis of just a content change. Because again, I don't think the public cares that floodplain regulations is going to chapter 14 instead of
No.
12. They don't care about that, but that has to be part of the ordinance.
Sure.
So,
But Adam, what we're saying is though it comes back to us sitting on this panel,
Yeah.
and I can tell you that the mayor and everybody else, and I don't want to miss something.
right.
So,
Bite-sized pieces.
that would be
Well,
nice if
and
we could just
also a
do it.
highlight of what the content changes are, so
Yeah.
that we are aware and can
You-
know.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about. Because we
Yeah.
can't approve it in bite-sized pieces. It all has to get approved together because the way everything's linked and
But
mixed.
couldn't we approve the changes to 8?
No, because then you're going to leave something orphaned. So if you change 8, then stormwater is no longer a regulation.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too,
Yeah.
but
Well, that's not a bad idea.
Sure.
And we're not responsible
So
for it then.
EPA.
Huh? That clears that up. There you go. We don't have to meet tomorrow night. Okay. I
But we could go through the content.
So
Yeah.
the reason why you don't have a red line is because it would have looked like someone bled all over it, because with all the reorganization, it would have just been all red lines. So we're more than happy to go back and create a document that shows the content changes and not the reorganization, so you can review it. And I don't want you to feel like you're giving you're not giving a yay or nay tonight. This is
Right,
this is
right.
round one, right? And so we can then go through those content changes. We'll talk about Section 8 maybe at one meeting, then we'll talk about, Title 14 or whatever that turns into at another meeting. We can take it in those bite-sized pieces. But the way that it's currently structured, we can't it was originally a whole bunch of ordinances, and Corey and I discussed it, and we weren't comfortable because they all need to go together, and so we were going to keep insisting that all these ordinances move together, and so that's why we decided to make it one. And I was as alarmed as you were that it was 96 pages when I was done putting it together, so I understand your concern when you see all of that. So, but we're happy to do that if you'd like to see that. So.
Mr. Mayor?
yes, Mr. Hammond.
Yeah, so just to kind of build on your point here and to confirm that I think that is indeed what we're looking for, is a red line of wording changes, not necessarily when we're moving from one page to a different page in the regulations, but where we're actually changing words. That really is our legislative purview, and that is something that we do have to understand as a body, what the changes are and what we're going to be telling our citizens. As far as the issue of do we do it all at once or can we do it in parts, I think the answer is we have to do the ordinance as one, but that doesn't mean that we can't break it up into more bite-sized chunks to review as we go along.
Yeah. And I think if we would have provided you a red line in the packet today, you would have been so tied up in the minutia, and we wanted this session to be able to introduce what we're trying to accomplish from a broad scale, and then split up and have those additional meetings to get into the detail.
Sure, and I appreciate that. I know where you're going with that, and I concur. However, when I get down to reading about Section C, where it talks about an alien plant, wow, Mr. Meisner.
Right.
Well, I agree. I mean, a red line on this would probably have looked like the historical red line, blue line trash ordinance that we had at one point that none of us maybe understood. So, but I think from my perspective, and what I'm hearing from council is we want to see the changes in verbiage. And if it's from an A to a B, I think those are the things that I'm concerned about. The basic changes, I trust you in terms of moving from here to there, but when you're changing a little bit of language, I personally would like to know what that change is.
Okay.
So can we potentially go in order as he is stated here and have Title 8 come back next? I know our team would love to
I think
be able to
that's,
keep
Could
the
you do
inertia
Title
going.
8 in one session? Could you do it in one session? Would you have to do more than one session for Title 8?
Well, we may have to do more than one, but we have to start with one. So do we have anything on the September Vision Committee meeting, September 19th, that we could bring it back at that time?
no, yeah, that'd be great. Yeah. And even if you can do it before and get it emailed out, well ahead of time, I'd be more than happy to fall asleep with this in my hands.
Before that, I would like just to get a brief overview of what the 5% changes are in Title 8 and Title 9, just so I have some,
Well,
some forethought. And
how long would it take you to get the verbiage change thing? I mean, if we could get that, I think that would help a lot of us.
That would, and actually, then you can actually look at the specific word changes in the complete sentence, and, you know, that really is helpful to review a red line like that.
I mean, if there's any urgency from my standpoint, it would be to get me a copy of this that shows the changes as quickly as possible. And I don't know what your time frame is to do that. But then once you've done that, then some of that stuff becomes not as important, I guess, from my perspective. Because if we go through the day, we're still going to be marking this up. And
I just wanted
No,
a little
the-
brief idea of what is
Your
it that
choice.
we wanted to change.
Sure. So just to reiterate the kind of the big picture, what are the tweaks or changes within Title 8? It's, again, cleaning up the definitions, pulling them all to the beginning of the chapter, clarifying definitions such as property. So we have the one definition right now of property, which basically includes everything. And we want to create two definitions, one definition for public property and one definition for private property. So that's one example of clarifying a definition. And then, as I had previously mentioned, we're adding a new definition for trailer to distinguish between a vehicle with a motor and one without. So those are some examples of some of the definition changes that you will see reflected in a red line version. Again, the littering is currently referenced in 3 different places within Title 8. It would become referenced in one place within Title 8. So that's another example of sort of cleaning up and getting rid of the redundant components of Title 8.
Dina? I mean, aren't all the Title 8 changes in pages 2 and 3 of the attached memo?
There might be a little bit more detail in the staff report. So
I mean,
maybe
that's the only title you cover in terms of the changes, but it pretty much gives you an outline format of the Title 8 changes. Is that inclusive of all of that? I mean, would that not answer Ms. Smith's
Yeah,
question?
I'm fine. We can move on.
I'm not trying to put it off, but I think that would give you what you want, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, well, not everything is in here. The examples, so again, the point of this was to be an overview and not get into the detail. But an additional example is we're clarifying in terms of the definition of weeds as a definition versus vegetative growth versus landscaping, right? Because we want to make sure that folks aren't being noticed and having to rip out landscaping versus really what is a weed and what needs to be mitigated in terms of a weed. So that's another example of something that's been cleaned up a bit and clarified within Title 8.
So is it possible you could email us this PowerPoint as well?
Yes. Yep.
Just so we have another point of reference to maybe be able to look back on.
Yep.
Okay.
I have a further question.
Ms. Hammer.
Yes. So, Adam, my question's for you. In terms of the flood, stormwater and floodplain, when we make these changes, the state is going to smile on us and say, you've complied with our new permit now.
Right, so what we have to do is we have to provide them a copy of it when it's done, and they check the box.
And then they check
say
the
we're
box.
good, yeah.
And so this exercise is intended to get that box checked.
Yes,
Yes.
yep.
If nobody has a question,
Do you have a question, Mr. Meisner?
I'll comment.
Go ahead.
If nobody else does. And this is just relative to Section 8, and these are some personal opinions. I would like to see some more specifics in terms of specifically how code enforcement will notify, and seems to be some conflicting verbiage in here, but my intent is that we don't hang stuff on people's doors. We give them some kind of a notice that we can verify that person actually received a notice, which is either, as I mentioned in some of these, a signed receipt or a registered or certified mail with return. And that eliminates a bunch of problems for me with code enforcement claiming we notified a customer and the customer telling me I never talked to anybody. So
Or
if
personal
we can get
delivery, too.
a black and white process so that we have a violation or a perceived violation by code enforcement and have some solid black and white communication means with the resident or whoever it is so that that issue is no longer a question. Because a huge percentage of the problems that I've been dealing with are stemming around that the customer's saying, you know, I never received it. And it would be nice if we didn't have to have that discussion.
And I,
Go ahead.
if I could elaborate on that as well, because we were home one day and got a notice left on our door, and had they knocked and actually spoken with us, we would have been able to tell them that the property that we were getting cited for weeds was not actually our property. So instead, we then have to call somebody to say, hey, we were given this notice, it's not actually for our property. So if somebody would have knocked on the door and just said, hey, these weeds over here, we could have said, that's actually not our property, that's our neighbor's property. So I think that human interaction is really important, and I know that people can get irritable when you knock on their door and hand them a, you know, a notification like that, but I do think it's important to have some sort of face-to-face with them and not just kind of hanging on the door and leave.
So we can go into that a little bit more, I think, when we get into the meat of Title VIII and explain the current enforcement process, and if we want to make any amendments to it, we can make amendments to it.
Okay.
Were all these definitions, do we currently have it in, I don't mean to make light of it, is it currently in the code, or there are additions? Like, I had circled some of these that even I have a little problem with. It's, I can't even find it now. Well, alien plants, I'm just biological management, cultural control.
Yeah.
I understand a lot of this stuff. Indigenous plants and stuff like that. An alien plant is one that's not indigenous to the state nor to the native plant community. My roses aren't indigenous to Colorado.
All that is actually under Chapter 8.33 in the current code.
What? On 8.3, okay.
So, just
was-
to give you a little background, you're required to have a noxious weed regulation and plan, and those are what those definitions are related to. They're related to your noxious weed regulations.
So that brings another question, Mayor. There's a new, I'm going to say new, is the undesirable plant management plan, am I saying that right? Is that
Right.
something we're adding, or
No,
has that
that-
already been
No,
there?
that's-
That's currently
currently in the code.
8.33.
And we have no option relative to home rule to opt out of that?
No. And you have an agreement with the county. The county implements your plan for you.
Okay.
That agreement's been in place for quite some time.
Do we know that they're doing that?
There may be
I-
a member
I
of
don't
council
personally know.
who's the liaison for the weed control people.
I don't want, no, we're not
But
going to.
these are just noxious weeds, right? So there's an additional weed enforcement by your code enforcement officers.
And they do enforce the noxious weeds. Yeah.
Right.
In fact,
John does.
the city pays a bill, we pay a bill for them maintaining it on city property too.
The county, that is.
Yeah.
So, but to clarify, that whole section is current, and we don't have any choice but
And a
to,
lot of it's based off model ordinances.
It's modeled
or-
after the
yeah,
state's
state
noxious
statutes.
because they
weed
make
regulation.
reference to state statute. Okay. You're up, John.
Is there the property, you made discourse on that. Are there different standards for private property and public property? Do we play by a different ballgame there? Just asking, you said property, and you want to make a distinction between, and I get it, between private property and public property. Is enforcement different on both? Or do we get a break one way or the other? Or?
No, I forget the specific reason why we clarified the definition, but I know it was an issue where it was something that wasn't clear in terms of what applies to private property versus public. I don't recall what the specific example is now. That might have been a discussion last
Well, you couldn't do
October.
fireworks on public property. So like you can't do fireworks on public property, but you can on private property.
Right. Can anybody else here think of a example of?
Well, let's just
But
stick with.
we'll take a
the-
note of that and bring that back to you next time we
But-
meet.
Well, and I make a big deal out of it, the points of weeds and things like that, the enforcement is the same for whether it's private or public. Weed's a weed wherever it grows. Basically, you're not going to give the city a pass because we have weeds somewhere. Are you? No. Okay, I like that answer, yes.
There was a distinction, I think, in trash between public and private property.
Maybe that was
Well, I know that there's a reference somewhere in here where it talks about,
I don't remember.
it talks about the disposal of trash on private and public property. I remember reading that somewhere.
Yeah, there is a distinction in that.
Oh, so well, right, so this also includes, since all of Title VIII definitions are going to be up front, any definitions that were in the current, now, the most recent trash ordinance, we've incorporated those into this draft ordinance
Right.
because they have to be. So that might have been the reason where the public
Yeah,
and
there's
private came
somewhere in
from.
here that I read that it makes, it makes reference to like depositing trash, which we talked about with somebody putting the trash in the container at Safeways. And it gets addressed in here in terms of some of those properties. Or people depositing trash in the park containers.
Oh, okay, that would make sense. Oh, okay.
I just remember that
Yes,
verbiage somewhere.
he's right. Yeah, okay. Well, on page 6, I had down here where it says X is mechanical control and BB is mechanical control. Is that a needed redundancy? It's the same verbiage. Or is it meaningful to have it like that?
Say what?
On page 6 of mine, it says mechanical, X is mechanical control, and you go down to BB, mechanical control is there verbatim.
Yep, that's a correction we'll need to make.
So
There should only be one.
Should be, okay. Okay, well, I just want to prove that I have read most of this.
You made it to page 6.
At least the definitions.
It was interesting, I got to tell you, I want to go through this whole thing.
We'll do it together. The other general point is when we talk about litter, when I read that, I think we get into a conflict with decorative old machinery and decorative metal. We need to try to address that as we move along, because as it's written, I think the people that are using antique machinery that is no longer in its original condition for
A landscape element.
landscape elements and metal for landscape elements, those would no longer be allowed as the way this is written.
You like toilet flower pots too?
No, well, I'm just telling you, the way it's written
Art,
is.
you can't, your freedom of expression in art, if it's a.
Well, I know, but it specifically says somewhere in here about old machinery that's no longer functional is not allowed.
Has that been in the code before? Has it? How have you handled that? Just assume it's a landscaping and good to go?
Typically, I mean, we see them all around where we
Yeah.
see old farm tractors.
Right.
And there's actually a particular case that I'm working on now that they have them, except it's something that I understand it's history. A lot of the stuff is history. They've had it for a long time. And I believe Jolene also, we do allow that because we understand that that's something that you want. It's not just they're being rusted away, and they are somewhat taking care of it, and they like it in their yard.
So the yard's taking care of the piece of equipment, looks like it probably fits.
Yeah, I mean,
You're
if
good.
there's
Okay.
8-foot weeds growing up next to it, we understand, well, that's not then therefore landscape if the weeds are growing within it.
Yeah, to address Mr. Meisner's point, it's been in the code anyway.
Yeah.
It's nothing new.
Correct.
Okay,
I
okay.
realize that, but we're also accepting a code. And if it's not appropriate, now's the time to address it. And I'm going to say, you need to address those things so that it doesn't become an issue, because he's already said that if there's weeds growing around it, they're going to look at it differently. And it's not the tractor that's the issue, it's the weeds. But because the weeds are growing around the tractor, we get the impression that it's no longer a part of the lawn decoration or the yard decoration. So we just need to get it clarified.
I have a question. On page 11, under E, on boarded up windows, is that one of the new elements in the code, or is that current?
Yes.
Right, so that is one of the new provisions that we had talked about a little bit in terms of adding that in. So that's something that council needs to consider, whether you would like to have that in and be added into the nuisance ordinance or not.
And I think that'll be, that's why we need to break it up into smaller sections. That'll be a big conversation. But another thing to maybe add or consider is that when we were talking about a lot of our abandoned homes in the area that were having squatters in them, especially St. Scholastica, we're looking into boarding up those windows to try and keep criminals from busting in. And I don't see where that could be a conflict there, where some abandoned homes need their windows to be boarded up for health and safety reasons.
Probably because this was
Right,
written
and-
specifically for a customer in town.
Well, this,
Yeah, that's what I was kind of worried
Well, it
about.
does
and
have
the
like,
location of this is in terms of offensive trade or business. So it doesn't address boarding up of residential properties.
I guess I kind of clarify that a little bit. So it does say that, the exception is there to secure the building due to damaged or broken windows. So in those abandoned homes, that's a lot of what we saw. There is a limit in there as to how long that can be boarded up. Hopefully, if the city is, working to try to address that abandoned home issue, it's not going to be boarded up indefinitely. I don't think the city wants to be boarding it up indefinitely or having someone else board it up indefinitely.
Well, some cities do, as long as they're boarded up, they're good. This is
And
where
if we
our
go,
conversation is.
if we go through that process, you're not going to complete that process in 30 days. So we would be in violation of ourselves, so we could ticket ourselves, take
Well, they-
ourselves to
they
court.
Don't
require
ticket
the
ourselves.
Property owner to do it. They require the property owner to do it. And if they don't, then the city could go in and put boards on windows if they
Which
wanted
we
to.
would then be in violation, because we did it.
And we can put an exception in there to address those issues.
I think we're starting to get in the weeds here. Why don't we go ahead and get the 8, maybe like we wanted, so we can look at that and get your slides, and then just continue these discussions at a later time, maybe. If we can get it prior to the vision committee so we have plenty of time to look at it, which you probably can, I think fair enough, we'll be well-versed and read through by the next vision committee meeting. Would that be fair enough?
Yep, I think we can absolutely do that.
And then if anybody here, certainly we could call you or Tony. Tony knows all the answers anyway, but in case we have questions. So if we can get that out to us as soon as possible, at least Title 8.
Yep,
That'd be appreciated.
will do.
Okay? Great. Any questions from anyone else? Again, I just want to thank you for this. I had no idea. I looked at 100 pages and I thought for sure, no, really?
Excuse me, Mr. Mayor?
Yes, sir. I'm sorry, go
The
ahead.
only thing I would like us to hope to do is, and I'm saying this based on comments that are made, is we got to be very cautious that we don't get too overwhelmed with certain things. And I'm going to use this E as a private example, okay? With regards to the boarded up windows and stuff like that. It ends up that the building official or his or her designee, when presented with documentation, that a time extension is necessary. I don't want to see us get bogged down into, okay, who makes that determination that they say 30 days is good, and somebody said, well, I need more than 30 days. On some of these things, we have to leave them as is and let those people who have the authority to give that extension the latitude that we're going to say that's their job and that's what they're going to do, because we don't want to have to come back and somebody calls me and they said that, well, they only gave me 30 days. I need 60 days. You see what I'm getting at? And we've had problems like that, okay? And we've had that in there. So somewhere along the line, we're going to have to say, folks, we trust your judgment when they come to you to ask for an extension, that you're going to give them the extension that's necessary. And then if they want to come back to us with a problem, we got to trust their judgment. That's the only thing I don't want to see happen. Other than that, I think everything we're doing is okay.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kids. Any comments of council? Ms. Gonzalez?
Over there.
Following with what Frank has said, I think that's a customer service issue, that when somebody's in need, I think they can look at each unique situation and say, I can tell that you need some help. And I know that they've done that in the past with a lot of other
And that's what I'm
regulations.
saying, but when they make that determination, then that's their determination to make. And I don't want us to come back with a complaint for somebody and say, all they gave us was 30 days, and they're telling you we want 60 days. You see what I'm getting at?
Well, I
That
do.
could be the problem.
You could
okay?
put language, because this is what we rely upon. If
Yeah.
someone's providing good faith effort
Right.
to meet the standard,
That's
we're,
it.
we're going to be flexible. If they're stonewalling us, we'll be less flexible. So that really, you could put that kind of language in there. As long as they're demonstrating good faith effort, we'll continue to work with them and provide them an extension. But sometimes that's the case and sometimes it's not.
Right.
I've seen that language in there though, Tony, somewhere. About good faith and being able to extend it.
Yeah.
During that window, if they're demonstrating good faith, that.
Yeah, it might be a financial burden, it might be a
Different
health burden.
considerations. You can't try to visualize or predict every situation, but I think that kind of generic guideline would be helpful.
And I've seen that, so that's fine. So, thank you again. If you can
Yeah,
get that
thank
out as
you.
soon as possible, we will look at it, make it 30 pages or less. No, I'm just kidding. But again, thanks
Might
for
be
doing
35
this.
or less.
So,
30
And
pages, we're gonna need a
I'm-
magnifying
Said
glass.
I'm-
32 pages.
Anybody have any more comments before I
Plus the
I
adjourn?
I
Ms.
have a
Smith?
final comment. I just wanted to welcome Tammy to the
Oh.
stand.
And she's still
very nice
here,
to have
by
her here.
golly. Okay, we're adjourned. Thank you.